Hello,
Cool.
everyone. Welcome to our Indie Game Devs Corner, a returning feature from previous years. If you've not tuned into Roll for Good before, maybe this is a new feature. Isn't that fun? And today we are talking to, if I can remember which side is the right side, this side, Ferne from CobblePath Games.
Hello.
Um, so, CobblePath Games is a two-person indie game dev company who make ttrpgs, but maybe making some more things you can hear about in this interview. What originally got you into game design?
So, I've been doing it without knowing what it was since I was very young. But in terms of tabletop RPGs, when I was at uni, we started, I got a group of friends and we started playing tabletop RPGs. And I'd never really done it before. I'd done it a tiny bit and I'd owned a couple of books, but I'd never actually played.
Mm-hmm.
So, we, of course, like a lot of people, delved into it by making our own worlds and plots and things, and that necessitated us changing the rules. So we thought, actually, writing a tabletop RPG, putting in a few illustrations, then releasing it as a PDF—that's a thing we don't need any extra, really developed skills to do. We have the skills to do it, so we started working on that. And 5 years later, we ended up releasing Locus.
So I wanted to ask about Locus. So if you're watching this and you don't know about Locus, it is CobblePath Games' horror game, their flagship game, perfectly themed for this spooky seasonal. And I wanted to ask you, what kind of mechanics did you use to make horror?
Cop-out answer is there are infinite ways. Figure them out. But actual answer, the way that we did it. So a few kind of core pillars of what we did was we wanted Locus to be based around characters rather than based around big cosmic monsters. A couple of reasons. One was the primary game that we were aware of in TTRPGs that was like hard horror was Call of Cthulhu, and
Mm-hmm.
we're not huge fans of Call of Cthulhu. It doesn't really scratch the itch for us. And
Yeah.
also, obviously, it's already there, so we wanted to kind of try and do something a bit different. And the other thing is that we find that the sort of more personal character-based horror operates better than horror that revolves around powerlessness,
Yeah.
because it's an interactive medium. You're interacting with it, and thus inevitably you're exerting power over what happens in the game. And if you
Yeah.
remove that, you kind of remove the game and turn it into just fiction, which is not what we wanted to achieve with our system. So we did a few things. One of the things is we boiled out a lot of the randomness. And by that, I don't mean we removed randomness. We still have dice rolls, we still have card draws in it, and they're both obviously random generators. But we made it so that the interaction of the dice with characters is very reliant on how their stats are, rather than the stats just being kind of like a small nudge one way or the other. Because I find that randomness tends to dissolve into farce very easily, because a common defense mechanism for humans is if you can't predict what's going to happen and you know that your choices aren't really that impactful on the outcome, we kind of pull back from caring a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a defense mechanism humans have. And I think a lot of the time you find that in systems that have very random dice rolls, people kind of pull back from feeling the gravity of the outcomes because it's not in their control. So we kind of wanted to reverse that a little bit. So in Locus, we've got a lot of, if you're good at something, you can expect to succeed at it most of the time. If you're bad at it, you can expect to fail at it most of the time. the point being that we wanted your choices in character creation to come back to bite you, basically. We want you to constantly be thinking, I did this. This was me. This was because of my choices, not just because of how the dice rolled out.
I made a character with plenty of flaws, and that might mean I end up in a horrible situation.
Yep. But you'll probably have some things you're good at in Locus.
Yeah.
Because you have to spend the amount of points and they balance out. So for every like really bad thing, you'll have something that's pretty good.
Yeah, what are some examples of some of the stats you can have in Locus?
So the stats in Locus are they're negative. So we've got, let's see if I can remember them. There's only 8. So it's frailty, clumsiness, carelessness, repulsion is one of them, ignorance, temper, as in how controlled are your emotions, and I don't remember the other ones right now. Yeah, the idea is that they're negative because in most horror stories, people don't succeed because of what they're good at, they fail because of what they're bad at. So you're not speccing what your character's strengths are, you're speccing their weaknesses, essentially.
I love that. That's a really beautiful way to build as well, because I'm looking at even those you listed, and I'm clumsy as hell. Like, I'm someone who, if I'm being chased down by someone with a chainsaw, I'm tumbling over. That's it. That's me gone. I wouldn't be a good final girl in like a horror movie. I'd be early to die.
I would either be one of the earliest or one of the last ones, depending on the flavour of the horror movie, I think. My dump stat is definitely frailty.
Yeah.
I am made of sticks and hope. Some other quick fire ways are injuries are permanent. Every character has a unique monster that is based on an event in their past. There's a whole chapter in the director's guide about how to make those monsters. The moment where people realize, oh, that's my monster, is like always one of the best parts of a Locus story.
Mm-hmm.
We've got items. So items are a thing. They come on their own cards. They're designed to be scribbled up really quick by the director, who's RGM, and then handed to players, and then they degrade and they break.
Mm-hmm.
So using items has a tangible, meaningful cost. There's a lot of kind of like things you do have a cost, and things have effects and they come back. So there's a lot of that in it. There's also one of the other things that we do that is not uncommon for horror games in tabletop RPGs. This is a very common one, but it is a common one for a reason. Is the game is designed to have? It's not. I wouldn't describe it as rules light, but it's designed to have rules that don't get in the way when you're playing, and it stops you. It also stops people from focusing too much on winning. Like mechanics-heavy games tend to result in at least a certain type of player kind of like, what's the most efficient thing I can do? What's the most effective choice I can make? Because that's part of the fun of mechanics-heavy games. Like, that's not an indictment.
Making a broken build in Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition is a treat sometimes.
Yeah. And like, if you're in a situation you want to like, and you've got all these mechanics, you kind of want to play with which one of these is going to be the most effective or the most cost effective or the most like give me the best result out of all the tools I've got. And that is not a mindset that works well with a horror story, because you don't want people paralyzed by choice to prevent. You don't want people being prevented from doing stuff because it might not be ideal.
Yeah.
Because in a horror story, that means they're never going to do anything.
Yeah, and if anything as well, for especially a lot of genres of horror, I'm specifically thinking of like the slasher genre, but it cross applies, is you want people to do the less than ideal thing you want to be sitting watching a horror film going, don't go down that corridor.
It's and on the occasions that you have characters that do all the right things, nearly always, either they're not very good horror movies, or the bad guy is so overwhelmingly powerful that it would be really unfun to play.
Yeah, well, thank you for that, like, little deep dive into Locus and how you made it scary and, you know, how people could start to think about running their own horror. You know, even if they've got their own system and the rules are kind of already set in stone, they can take those elements. Especially think that building individual monsters or, like, a lingering injury, that sort of thing can be very, very easy to slide into any system. But why don't we 180 and talk about Coffee and Chaos, which is your other game, which Ferne has beautifully displayed behind her.
Yes.
Which is a very different vibe, if you couldn't tell from the charming artwork.
Yeah.
So Coffee and Chaos is you're running a cafe or restaurant or some such similar business, and it's like the most chaotic worst day.
It's just going very wrong, basically. You're playing. So the pitch is you're playing your characters from other stuff. You don't have to. You can make up characters for it. But you're playing your characters from other role plays, from other stories, from TV shows you like, whatever. And you're playing them as they fail miserably to run a cafe for a day, basically. It's very silly. It's a really good kind of like one shot for either between sort of like story arcs in a big RPG, or when someone can't make it, or if your DM just hasn't had time to like do their prep this week because it's GMless, which means also that your DM can bring like their favorite NPC or villain and have them run the cafe with you. It's also setting agnostic, so you can do like a cyberpunk bar, you can do like a vampire wine bar, you can do a D&D tavern. It's very silly, it's very fun. We only released it last month, digitally at least, and I believe you can pick up the physical copies from Soul Muppet. They're the only store that has them at the moment. Keep an eye out for other people. We're just bad at organising that. It is printed on a menu as well. Wait a second.
Oh yeah, do us a show and tell.
So, printed on a menu.
Fantastic.
And the rest, the card draw results are on a table talker, which is one of those triangular things you find on restaurant tables.
Amazing.
So there's that.
You saying we didn't want to make board games because there's too much stuff. Maybe you should make a board game, you know? Not to put the pressure on.
We do actually have a couple of things in the works that are
exciting.
Board game adjacent. So Coffee and Chaos is our third game. Our second game was Stacks of Goblins. Which is also a comedy game. Mm-hmm. Also a GM-less comedy game. And that one, we are working on both a deck builder card game spin-off and what we're hoping is going to be a hybrid tabletop RPG board game spin-off of Stacks of Goblins. So those should be fun when they're done. Also, Locus is getting a spin-off. A prequel spin-off. We're doing a solo world building RPG that's intended to create Malice Locuses for your story. So you do the solo RPG, and then you as the director have the bulk of the resources that you need to then run your campaign, is the idea.
There's so much. There's so much to come.
Yeah. Oh, that's not even like the biggest ones.
They're the back burners. They're not even on the front burner.
Well, I think the Locus Insight will probably be the next thing we release because it's the most done.
Yeah.
At the moment. The Goblin games are... I need to do a lot of art for them, so they take a long time.
Understandable. Yeah.
And then the other bigger projects are like mostly back burner at the moment,
Yeah.
but there are some bigger projects kind of hopefully on the horizon for us.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, if I think you've set me up for a little segue into what I wanted to ask you about next, because I have heard that there may be some moves towards live action roleplay, or LARP, as I'm sure most people will know the acronym. And I had a double prong question I wanted to ask about going from tabletop game design to LARP design, which is what's been the biggest change? Because you can imagine what some of the big changes are, but I'm curious what you have found they are. But also what has stayed kind of the same between thinking about a tabletop game and a live action role playing game.
so it's kind of interesting. I think in terms of the biggest difference, really it's thinking about the physical engagement with different parts of the game. In a tabletop RPG, there isn't a barrier to playing a barbarian versus a wizard. There isn't a barrier to playing someone who is physically incredibly fit and capable in a fight and someone who doesn't fight at all and is a crafter.
Mm-hmm.
Very few TTRPGs let you do both of those because they're very different game types. But the fact of the matter is that if you were to spec them up, there wouldn't be barriers in the place. Whereas with LARP, you have those barriers and you have to acknowledge them when designing. Because there are people who are not physically capable of playing the combat game. And there are people who are not physically capable of playing certain parts of the combat game. That's been one of the things that really is most out of the wheelhouse, I think, of tabletop RPGs. The other thing is scale as well. Tabletop RPGs, you're designing them for like 7 people max, usually. LARPs are like, well, the scale of the ones we're looking at, like 50 to 100 people. Like, that is a completely different ballgame in terms of the ability to control things and also the amount that you've got to offer. Because, like, in tabletop RPGs, a lot of discussion goes into how do I make sure that all of my players are doing the same thing? How do I make sure that they're not splitting the party because that's unmanageable? How do I make sure that they're all interested in the plot that I'm coming up with and they want to engage with it, etc., etc.? In LARP, it's kind of the opposite. How do I make sure there's enough stuff on the table that everyone has some like stuff to engage with? Because you can't get 50 people doing the same thing. It doesn't work, and it's also not a challenge.
Yeah, two very pressing things to think about. Your accessibility and how you're going to cater for the greatest number of people as much as you possibly can. And then also, there are now way more people.
And I'm not somebody who can really talk about this issue with any authority. I'm just someone who has an idea of how we can approach it from a design point of view. Yeah, that's kind of about as much as I've got on it, really. Our LARP isn't going to have races. It's just not got them. There are classes, or we call them aspects, because it's a dream world. So you manifest differently. So there are still choices that affect what you can do in game, in character creation.
Yeah.
And there's still like some sort of like groups that characters can fit into, but they're not biological and they're not racial. And they don't have that baggage. And that's not just in the rules, that's also in the world written. They are not like geographically linked, they are not racially linked, they are just how people manifest in the dream world, which I hope is a more appealing concept and a more appealing approach to it than the types that I know have turned people away.
I also wanted to ask about how mechanics actually work in your LARP and how you transferred from having the mechanics of a tabletop role-playing game and how you then turn that into a design of a LARP.
Okay, so I will start with the basic kind of like design principles that we went with. So when we design a game, we try to give ourselves a few bullet points of kind of like, these are our sort of guiding lights. These are the things that we want to achieve, and then we can check what we're designing against those. So yeah. What is this doing?
What is this doing can apply to what is this dice roll doing, through to what is this foraging token doing, through to what is this setting description doing.
Yes. If you don't acknowledge the outcomes of your decisions, that doesn't stop them having outcomes.
Yeah. So always be asking your question, what is this doing? What purpose is this serving? What is this doing? What will my audience get out of this?
Yeah. Does it do what I want it to do?
Yeah.
Does it meet my design goals? Or at least move me towards them?
I think that is a good, final stopping point, that little takeaway. Thank you for that insight. I think that's a very good little wrap up. I hope you have a fantastic LARP that you are at right now.
Yes.
Well, goodbye, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the show, and you will see more games later.